Can we start? Okay. I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which was mostly organized by Maggie Gochen of the Ararat Eskija Museum, and the co-sponsors are the Narekatsi Chair in Armenian Studies at UCLA, the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and the topic is For a Better Understanding of St. Gregory of Narek Prayers, a conversation between Dr. Abraham Terian and Dr. Peter Cowe. On a sad note, we lost two members of the Armenian Studies community recently, so I'd like to acknowledge Denis Papazian. He was the founder of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan, where he was also a professor of history. He was twice president of the Society for Armenian Studies and an editor of the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. He was a director of the Armenian Assembly of America between 1975 and 78. And he was a charter member of NAASR. Also, we lost Dr. Garbet Mamjan, who is a PhD from UCLA, and there's many professors here from UCLA, so that's good to see. He was a respected Ottomanist and a scholar on Armenian genocide. He was the principal of the Armenian Mesropian School. He was the vice principal of the Shamyan School, and he served on the ARF Western USA Central Committee, and he was a member of the Asparez editorial board. Today we're going to be basically having a musical presentation by Vache Mankarian. Then we're going to have Dr. Abraham Terian give a talk on his book after I introduce him. And then we're going to have a conversation between Dr. Cowe and Dr. Terian. And then there's going to be a reception in the museum after the presentations. So Vache Mankarian is a concert pianist, composer, author, lecturer, and educator. He has a Doctor of Musical Arts degree from the University of Southern California's Thornton School of Music. Mankarian has taught at USC's Thornton School of Music, Los Angeles Valley College, Glendale City College, at several Los Angeles area Armenian private schools, including the Hovsepian School in Pasadena. And he's on the faculty at the Pasadena Conservatory of Music, where he teaches piano, chamber music, composition, and music history courses. Mankarian has authored 3 volumes of textbooks titled Armenian Culture, written in Armenian and published in the United States in 2006. So Vache Mankarian, please make your musical presentation.
I'd like to thank Maggie for inviting me to be part of this program today afternoon. Maggie asked me to present a well-suited musical piece for the afternoon program, and since Gregory of Narek has works, I figured I'd play another work by another Armenian priest named Gomidas. Gomidas has written several pieces for the piano, but they're very sort of intricate and delicate pieces for the instrument. I'd like to have her play a set of transcriptions of 3 of his songs. that I have done a few years ago. This is the second set that I've done of Komidas' songs. The first set I did many, many years ago, and this is the second one of 3 songs. I'll let you guess which songs they are as I play them. One brief note also, this is a piano that the museum just acquired, and I have to congratulate Maggie for having the vision to do such a thing. I'm not quite sure how many Armenian organizations own a Steinway piano, and so Maggie, thank you for getting this piano. The only unfortunate thing is it was tuned a few months ago, but because of the weather and the cold space in here, the lowest octave is out of tune, so please forgive that.
Thank you, Vache. That was wonderful. I want to start with a picture of Narek'S, or Monastery of Narek. This is a 1911 photograph by Yervant Lilian. It was a 10th century Armenian monastery in Vaspurakan near Lake Van, and Gregory of Narek notably flourished here. The monastery was abandoned in 1915, reportedly demolished around 1951, and a mosque now stands on its location. This is another picture of Narek'S around 1900, and you could see Ahtamar Island on Lake Van in the background. And from this exact same vantage point, this is a picture from 2019. You could see the Ahtamar Island on Lake Van in the background, and now there's a mosque there. Narek'S is gone, but Grigor Narekatsi's words survived, which brings us to tonight's event. Dr. Abraham Terian was born in Jaffa, Israel. The Armenian St. Nicholas Monastery in Jaffa, which overlooks the Mediterranean, is pictured here. Dr. Abraham Terian grew up in the Armenian quarter of Jerusalem with the brand new Mardiki Museum, the St. James Monastery, the Kalus Gulbenkian Library, and the St. Xavier Complex and Cemetery. Here's the school that he attended, St. Takmanchat's Armenian School, or School of the Holy Translators. And there's a football field or soccer field which goes right up to the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. Here's another picture to give you an idea of where the school is with its soccer field in relationship to the Dome of the Rock and the Western Wall. And you can see that the old city of Jerusalem isn't very big, and I got to believe that this environment really shaped some of the decisions that Dr. Abraham made in his education and his career. Dr. Abraham Terian was a tour guide for 6 years, and I just learned today that he met his wife while she was visiting from Finland on one of these tours. And Aram Khachaturian, who's pictured here, is a cousin of his, and he was my tour guide this past January when I was visiting. Dr. Abraham Terian has a bachelor's degree in history and biblical languages, a master's degree in archaeology and history of antiquity, and in 1981 he got his doctorate of theology in early Christianity at the University of Basel. Dr. Abraham Terian was a professor at Andrews University between 73 and 93, the University of Chicago between 84 and 87, and Sterling College between 1993 and 1997. In 1997, he became the academic dean of the St. Nersess Armenian Seminary, and he has since got the title emeritus professor. In 2005-2006, he was a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Humanities, the most prestigious appointment in the Fulbright Scholar Program. And he was a visiting professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 2006. In 2008, the Gathrigos Karakin II bestowed the St. Sahak and Mesrob Award in recognition of his outstanding academic and literary contributions and service to the Armenian Church. In 2008, he became a Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences of the Republic of Armenia. In 2010, he was the 8th Kazan visiting professor at Cal State University Fresno, and he resides in Fresno today. He's also a Fellow of the Ambrosian Academy of Milan, and he's on the board of directors of the Armenian Volunteer Network. He's held several leadership roles at the Society of Biblical Literature, the Society for Armenian Studies, and he was on the editorial board of a scholarly journal devoted to furthering the study of Hellenistic Judaism, and in particular the writings and thoughts of Philo of Alexandria. Here's a picture of Dr. Terian presenting his books to Pope Francis in 2022. Dr. Abraham Terian has contributed to at least 16 publications. The first one relates to Philo of Alexandria, and he did the translation of, I believe, something that was only available in the Armenian language. He did the English translation in 1981, and he did the French translations in 1988 and 1992. Here's a book edited by Avdi Sanjan, David Anakt, and it includes a chapter from Dr. Abraham Terian. He's had several articles in the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. He's also the founding editor of the St. Nersess Theological Review. In 2005, he published Patriotism and Piety in Armenian Christianity. And he also contributed to two of the books edited by Richard Hovhannisyan on Armenia, Cilicia, and Pontus. In 2008, he published Macarius of Jerusalem, Letter to Armenians. In 2008, he published The Armenian Gospel of the Infancy. In 2012, he published Biblical History and Epic Verse by Grigor Magistros. In 2016, he published the Festal Works of St. Gregory of Narek, and this won the 2017 Dr. Sona Aronian Book Prize for Excellence in Armenian Studies from NAASR. In 2021, he published The Fathers of the Church, and this brings us to today's book, published in 2021, From the Depths of the Heart, Annotated Translation of the Prayers of St. Gregory of Narek. Also, this won the 2022 Dr. Sona Aronian Book Prize for Excellence in Armenian Studies by NAASR, and he's the only repeat winner of this award. And he's been busy this year too. In 2023, he published Life of Mashtots by his disciple Koriwn. Now I'm going to cover Dr. S. Peter Cowe. He started off in Scotland, and he started in the classics, Latin and Greek, at Aberdeen University. He was in Yerevan State University, where he conducted manuscript research at the Matenadaran Institute, 1980 to 81. He received a degree from Oxford in Armenology, and in 1983 he received a PhD in Armenology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So that's something he has in common with Dr. Abraham Terian, who taught there. Dr. Peter Cowe taught at the Hebrew University from 83 to 84. He taught at the University of Chicago. He taught at the Columbia between 84 and 96. He joined the faculty of the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures in 1996. In 2000, he was appointed as the Gregory of Narek Chair in Armenian Language and Culture at UCLA. And he's also the director of the Center for World Languages at UCLA. He's a founding member of l'Association Internationale des Études Arméniennes, also a founding member of the Society for the Study of Caucasia. He's held several positions at the Society for Armenian Studies, including past co-editor of the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies. He's a recipient of the Garbis Papazian Award for Armenology. He was inducted into the Academia Ambrosiana of Milan. He has a honorary doctorate degree from the Russian Armenian University of Armenia. Dr. Cowe has contributed, translated, or edited these publications, including many articles in the Journal for the Society for Armenian Studies. He had this book in 1991, Commentary on the Divine Liturgy by Khosrov Anatwaki. I apologize for the pronunciation. He had a chapter in this volume on the Armenian as a pluricentric language. He had published in 1992 the Armenian version of Daniel. In 1993, Mikhitar Sanatsi's Theological Discourses. In 1994, he translated the Deaconess in the Armenian Church. In 1994, he had the catalog of Armenian manuscripts in the Cambridge University Library. In 1997, he contributed a chapter on the Georgians in The Glory of Byzantium, edited by Helen C. Evans. He had an article in the St. Nersess Theological Review. He contributed to these volumes edited by Richard Hovhannisyan. In 1999, he published a book, along with others, manuscripts at UCLA. In 2000, he edited Modern Armenian, a drama, an anthology. In 2001, he published Ani, World Architectural Heritage of a Medieval Armenian Capital. In this NAASR volume, he published a chapter on the future of Armenian studies. He was the editor for Minas of Jajur, and he contributed 2 chapters to the Cambridge History of Christianity, Volume 5, Eastern Christianity. And in 2008, he published Daredevils of Sassoon, Poetics of an Epic. Now I invite Dr. Abraham Terian to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming on this Saturday afternoon. Also, I want to thank those who are following us live as this discussion is being broadcasted. Although I was asked to say something about how I came about to do this book, about which we'll be talking today, St. Gregory of Narek's prayer book. I'm sure this, among other questions, will arise during our discussion, and for the sake of time and to see how soon we're done until Mrs. Maggie Goshin signals us as to when our time is up, I'm sure during our discussion there will be much that will be on the minds of many of you present here and those who are following us at home. Be that as it may, let me say how happy I am that I have today as my interlocutor Professor Peter Cowe. I have met Professor Cowe in the 1970s while he was a graduate student at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I want to thank Rupen for the introductions and also for the pictures from the Armenian Quarter of Jerusalem. You know how easy it is for me to become homesick. Also in our audience today, I have an old classmate from our elementary school days at St. Mashtots in Jerusalem, Mr. Hagop Chakrian, whom I'm very happy to see. We were the most intimate friends as teenagers. Anyway, thank you all. I want to thank my wife who is present here. She has been my companion for almost 60 years. And we drove together this morning from Fresno, and we chatted most of the way. That made it a very pleasant ride, and thank God for the good weather.
Absolutely. So I'm also very delighted to have the opportunity to have this discussion with Abraham. As he indicated, we go way back, and I'm going to bring up fairly quickly this Jerusalem connection. So one of the things that I thought would be good is if we discuss a number of issues connected with the book, and of course the two gentlemen involved, so Abraham Terian and Gregory of Narekatsi. So we'll begin with a number of general questions, and then we'll gradually segue into more particular detail relating to the author, St. Gregory Narekatsi, and then we'll move into the work and different aspects of how it was created, what its reception was, and then we'll end up with a much greater focus on this particular volume, the volume that we're reviewing particularly for today, and which is available for sale. And so I think it's not too early to put in a plug for this. So those of you that have not had the opportunity to purchase a copy so far, this is an excellent opportunity, and I'm sure that Dr. Terian will be delighted to sign copies after the event. So this is a wonderful chance that you have to have the additional Troshim. We're going to be talking later on about, just very quickly, about the sacrament of Troshim, of chrismation. And so obviously with his Magakruchun, his signature, this will add an extra element to the book that you will have the opportunity to obtain today. So, as you know, we're here to consider then Dr. Terian's critical introduction and annotated translation of the Book of Lamentation, the Madyan Volperkuchan of Krikor Narekatsi. So I'm delighted that you were able to come today, because fundamentally this work is one of, if not absolutely the most consequential work in Armenian literature. At the same time, I'm very pleased that we were able to make this happen on a day like today, not only because of the weather, etc., but also the liturgical season. We are, of course, towards the end of Great Lent. Great Lent, of course, a period of sobriety, of self-examination, and this, of course, is very much in tune with the underlying topic of today's book. At the same time, of course, we are in Lazarus Saturday, so we're on the cusp of Holy Week and already very much looking towards Easter and salvation and the new life that resurrection brings. So Dr. Terian and myself, we have selected a number of readings which we'll intersperse in the conversation, and this will give you something then of the flavor of the work, and more particularly of Dr. Terian's translation. So I'd like to begin with one from the near the beginning of his work. This is Prayer 3, Section 2. This is very much part of the introduction, and it very much looks forward then to the overall development of the work in later chapters, and it will give you a flavor of the work overall. Yes. This newly sung Book of Laments is descriptive of feelings common to every race of rational beings, wherever they may be planted on the earth, expressed by one aware of the passions besetting all, who, as a companion well informed of everyone's needs, has transferred them to his own image. It is for the whole body of diverse congregations of Christians worldwide, for those who have reached life's first cycle, for adolescents in the second stage, for those near the end of their days, turned frail in old age, for sinners and righteous, for the arrogant obsessed with themselves, and the remorseful ones found reproaching themselves, for good people and for evildoers, for the cowardly and the brave, for slaves and subordinates, for nobles and the elite, for the middle class and the gentry, for laborers and feudal lords, for men and women, rulers and subjects, for captives and the much less fortunate, for the eminent and the lowly, for persons of rank and commoners, for cavalrymen and foot soldiers, for city dwellers and villages, for those restrained by the cruel bridle of insolent kings, for ascetics conversing with heavenly beings, for the chaste sages with godly decorum, for priests chosen for their blessed piety, for overseers with proper oversight, ecclesiastical presidencies entrusted with the sacred duty of supervision. May earnest supplications be made on behalf of some, and the good counsel be given to others through the prayers in this book. I have endeavored, through the power of your Spirit, to compose these diverse entreaties, and to present the petitions of all, so that they may become daily with them before your great compassion. I think this is an excellent indication then of the widespread significance of the prayers. They are for all over the world and at different times in history. As is already clear, Abraham and I share a tie to Jerusalem. I did my PhD there. Abraham spent his early years there. So I wonder if you could tell us something about what life was like there, and in particular, what was your introduction to the Narek at that point in your life, at, of course, a relatively early age? Do you have memories about having a copy, about hearing about its significance, perhaps exploring its contents?
Well, thank you, Peter. If I may backpedal a little bit, I should have introduced in our audience Professor Hagop Kuluchian, who in his own right is a Narekatsi scholar, and he could have joined us here with a third chair. We could have discussed more things in common. I also want to acknowledge in our audience Professor Rubina, whom I have known for decades, and I've read her massive volume on early Armenian literature. So good to see you here. So we're not the only two authorities on Narekatsi here, though I must say Professor Cowe is just as much knowledgeable about this book and its predecessor, and more so about a work composed by the very father of St. Gregory of Narek, namely, as we were introduced to, Khosrov Antsevatsi. He was the bishop of Antsevatsi. It's an Armenian district southwest of Lake Van, and he wrote two liturgical commentaries on the daily hours, Jamerkutun, Shamakirk, and also on the divine liturgy, the Badarak. And Professor Cowe has a very distinguished book that deals with the work of Khosrov Antsevatsi. Anyway, this is just by way of further introduction to the people in our midst who are just as knowledgeable about Gregory of Narek as the two of us. Now, I grew up in Jerusalem, and we ended up in the Armenian convent of St. James during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And my grandfather, who was for generations a native Jerusalemite, and for generations they were the tailors for the Brotherhood of St. James. So we were given a very special place in the Armenian convent. The room in which our family, my siblings, there were 5 of us, grew up, is actually the closest room to St. James Cathedral. And I underline the word closest because literally it's a niche within the chapel of Echmiadzin, which is the southern fourth of St. James Cathedral. And just outside our wall, there was a gochnag, the kind of wooden bell to invite people to church, to breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever. In effect, I grew up within the St. James Cathedral. From our very beds, we could hear every service within St. James. So being roused with the bell, awake at 5 a.m., we could hear the whole morning liturgy, the Jamer Coutume, be it in the morning, be it in the afternoon, Saturday Badarak, Sunday Badarak. We heard it right there in our room. One actually couldn't live any closer within St. James Cathedral as we did. So we grew up with these prayers, and then, of course, not just from our room, but in person within the cathedral, we will join some of these prayers, and especially during the night vigil, when certain portions of the prayer book of St. Gregory of Narek were recited, or rather chanted, and we would kneel and chant them together. And not only that, at St. James, for those students who excelled in their class, the usual award was a copy of the prayer book of St. Gregory of Narek. And so I ended up with a couple of them and have read them as an early teenager. Be that as it may, what brought me further to do this kind of work, as it was mentioned in the introduction, I taught at St. Nersess Armenian Seminary from 1997 to 2008, the year I retired. Now, I should tell you something about St. Nersess Armenian Seminary in Armonk, New York. It moved a few years ago from New Rochelle to a better and nicer location. I should say expanded into a better environment. All our instruction at St. Nersess is in English, except, of course, for liturgy and classical Armenian. All other courses we teach at St. Nersess are in English. It is part of our affiliation contract with St. Vladimir Seminary, and through whom we are accredited, and so forth. But yet, all our sources are in classical Armenian. So it's, in a way, challenging to teach a course in English when all your sources are in classical Armenian. So what we teachers did from class to class, depending on the class, we would translate some of the very texts we brought to class in the original classical Armenian language. And so several of my books actually were initially handouts to share with the seminarians. And over the years, a decade plus couple years, and then in retirement, I came to realize if I were only to add a few more here, a few more there, I can complete a book. But my books, by and large, are to be noted not so much for the translation, which in and of itself is a major contribution, but the introductions to these books I have translated. Every introduction I have is, in effect, a breakthrough within the scholarship devoted to that particular book. And I trust I have done so in this one. Now, I should very briefly address as to how it came to be further that I did this book and its predecessor, this one, a picture of which you were shown. This particular book, Annotated Translation of the Odes, Litanies, and Encomia of St. Gregory of Narek, these are his poetic works composed for various major feast days for the liturgical year. I strongly believe that in the medieval Armenian monasteries, the abbot of the monastery, the Vanahair, every time a major feast was impending, and as you know, in the Armenian church, we have Nachadonank, pre-feast day, where the anticipated feast is celebrated on the eve of the feast. And so the abbot would approach one of the monks, conceivably the more distinguished among them, and would say, you know, tomorrow is the presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary by St. Joachim and Anne, or within a month or so we are celebrating the Feast of the Cross. Why wouldn't you compose something for the occasion as we celebrate within our circle? And so I strongly believe that all these odes and hymns and panegyrics, the litanies composed by St. Gregory of Narek, these were for such feast days, and interestingly enough, with very few gaps where some are lost, we have the whole array of his compositions surrounding the liturgical year. So these would be of interest, of course, to our seminarians. So this is what I was translating during our course on St. Gregory of Narek, among other things. Whereas this prayer book is well known in a previous English translation by Dr. Tom Samuelian, a very beautiful English translation. I like it, and we used it because it's dynamic English translation. Yet the challenge, of course, once we come teachers to classroom with the original text, we have the Armenian text, and of course, vis-a-vis the Armenian text, a dynamic English translation does not always do justice to the literal meaning of the text. So my challenge was, in translating this book, to keep it as literal as possible, and yet as beautiful in English as conceivably possible. And to what extent I have succeeded to do this remains to be seen. But anyway, so I will make it very brief as to how this first book was published in 2016. It was late in the fall 2014. Being a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, it is the world's largest society of biblical scholars, theologians, more than 7,000 of them all over the world. They come to the United States once a year for a conference. Every 4 years, the conference happens to be in California, usually in San Diego. And so around Thanksgiving, Sarah and I, my wife and I, headed to San Diego to attend the annual conference. There will be more than 50 sessions going on at the same time in these conferences. But more interestingly, more than 100 publishers exhibit their latest books in quite sizable booths at these convention halls. And so I like to zigzag through these alleys where these exhibitors, the editors, have their latest books. And I saw the acquisition editor of the Liturgical Press, which is the largest Catholic publisher in the United States. I had no intention to approach him. I had no intention to publish a book. But just seeing him there and passing by the booth, somehow serendipitously, I decided to approach him. And I told him that I have a book, the Odes, Litanies, and Panegyrics of St. Gregory of Narek. Well, he said, I've never heard of Gregory of Narek. Would you tell me a few things about him? So I told him a few things about St. Gregory of Narek, and he said, look, you have persuaded me, but when I go to Minnesota, there's a whole team of editors I have to persuade. So you have to give me 4 months and you will hear from me. Well, 4 months from Thanksgiving would take us into March or April. That's what editors usually promise, within 4 months you will hear whether or not we'll publish your book. Anyway, on February 21, Radio Vatican announced that Pope Francis is about to proclaim an Armenian saint by the name of Gregory of Narek as Doctor of the Universal Church. Well, they heard it in Minnesota. Same day in the afternoon, they called me to say, we'll publish your book. Now, that was something providential because the Pope's pronouncement took the Catholic world by surprise. Not many, hardly a handful of Catholic medieval scholars would have known something about St. Gregory of Narek. So there was quite a curiosity among Catholic scholars to want to know more about St. Gregory of Narek. So that book was a timely publication, to put it briefly. But soon the publisher learned that this book that got published in 2016 is not really the magnum opus, the major work of St. Gregory, but that his prayer book is the more distinguished work. So they were on my back to kind of translate this, and with reluctance, because I had other things to translate. When you learn, as Professor Cowe and Professor Koriwn and Professor Rubina, when you read something in classical Armenian, it just cries to you, translate me, because it is so overwhelming. You get touched by it, and as if the medieval author's call pleads with you to translate his work. So, knowing the Madhyan Vohperkutyan, commonly known as the Book of Lamentations, a title about which we may talk between us, I had no heart to say no. So within a couple of years, I was able to translate this book, not really from scratch, but with previous translations here and there, and it was not all that difficult to complete. But I must say, writing the introductions has always been the more challenging part of doing a book on a medieval Armenian author.
If I may, I'd like to piggyback exactly on what you mentioned. I understand, of course, that you went to Rome and you presented a copy of the translation to Pope Francis. And I was curious. So obviously for a millennium, this work was transmitted in Armenian. It was known, it was loved, it was valued by the Armenian church, the Armenian community. But now, it of course enters into a whole new vista. And I'd be very curious to get a sense then of your recollection of the event in Rome and your perception of how this changes then the significance of Krikor Narekatsi and the Madhyan Vohperkutyan for the future.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to relate the question and the response to something very dear and close to the hearts of every Armenian. In the year 2015, we celebrated the centennial of the Armenian genocide. Not say celebrate, commemorated. And on that occasion, of course, the Armenian Apostolic Church canonized all the martyrs of the 1915 Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. Now, in Armenian we have a saying, "Dzur nastink shidaq khosink," to sit somewhat crooked, but let's talk straight. Given all the commemorations that we Armenians observed, and even non-Armenians, not just within Armenian communities and in Armenia, and in various parts of the Armenian diaspora. Apart from the canonization of our martyr saints, nothing surpassed or excelled what Pope Francis did on that occasion, when on April 12, he officially announced St. Gregory of Narek as Doctor of the Universal Church. You know, we Armenians did not quite get the point which I believe Pope Francis was making. While we Armenians were so much involved or enwrapped in commemorating our saints of 100 years ago, in effect, Pope Francis was telling us, don't forget your great saint of 1,000 years ago. So while we were thinking of 100 years ago, Pope Francis took us back 1,000 years back. And his message is very, very appropriate. You know, we Armenians, God forbid we ever forget the genocide. But given our absorption in it, to the point of as if this has become our present day identity, has made us oblivious, by and large, to our rich medieval heritage, which we should never forget. Our history is not confined to what happened to our people 100 years ago. We have such a glorious history, such a rich literary heritage, a wonderful identity. Much of it, of course, wrapped around the church, but be that as it may, that's all we have left, so to speak, and the small slice of our ancestral land in the present Republic of Armenia. You know, this is in effect our identity of millennia, not just the last 100 years or what happened to our people 100 years ago. And so it speaks to our people first and foremost, and then of course to the Roman Catholic world by and large, to whom Pope Francis introduced our great saint, and they love it. I was in Rome, as you mentioned, Peter, exactly a year ago, and for the first time in the Vatican, they celebrated the feast of St. Gregory of Narek on the traditional Armenian date, February 27. There was an ecumenical service, and then there was a conference at the Pontifical University where there was a lengthy introduction in Italian to this book, kind of a book review, so to speak. And then I gave a little talk, and it was much appreciated. But of course, for me and for my wife, to meet with the Holy Father, Pope Francis, was indeed unforgettable. In fact, my wife would never forget one sentence the Pope addressed to her. He said, "Pray for me." And he was as genuine as a human being can be. You cannot help but love him.
Yes. So moving on, perhaps you mentioned already the importance of the title. The title, of course, tells a great deal about the content. Madyan, so basically book, and clearly, of course, in its original from roughly 1003, this would relate to a manuscript, and the work is of such a size that presumably originally it occupied itself one whole manuscript, and so this was how in the early days the work was transmitted. Now, what about the second element in the title? Oft-Repeated. There have been all sorts of perspectives on this. So maybe, Abraham, you might like to discuss some of those.
Well, some of the titles given to this book in translation are, of course, interesting, but I personally believe they are a little bit off. For example, there is an English translation of this prayer book called
The Book of Sadness.
Yes.
Book of Sadness.
That's not what it is.
Very, very far from what it really means.
It's not even a book of lamentation, much as the word lamentation is an exact rendition of the word Oft-Repeated. But we tend to forget yet another meaning of the Armenian word Oft-Repeated. Oft-Repeated is a penitential prayer. Madian Oft-Repeated, I would translate book of penitential prayers, and that would be just as accurate translation of the Armenian title. But of course, I didn't use it even with this book because not every would-be reader would be in the mood of penitence or penance.
But perhaps penitence would be easier than lamentation.
Exactly. Well, having just gone through the season of Lent, of course, one would say how wonderful it would have been had in Armenian churches the Armenian faithful been guided through this book of penitential prayers. I don't know if it happened anywhere. I wouldn't rule out certain places, but how wonderful and timely it would have been to go through this prayer book during that season, or if not, to go through this prayer book during the year. Now, although altogether there are 95 lengthy prayers that comprise this book, but each of these prayers is in turn comprised of a number of prayers, some 2, 3, 4, 5, some more than 20 sections, that if we were to add up all these sections within these 95 major prayers, we can come up with a prayer for each day of the year. And by one count, it would be exactly that.
Mm-hmm. I was very curious, if I may ask, Abraham, what is the role that this work has had in your personal spiritual life, in your meditation?
It's time for confession. You know, I do spend a lot of time with the books I publish, and sometimes I must confess this comes at the expense of family. Anything and everything one does in life, as a rule, is done at the expense of something else. But I pray to God that no one would do anything at the expense of one's family. But, you know, one has to every now and then seclude oneself in one's study and do study. In fact, in medieval times, the monks, as you know, believed that study is prayer. And even work is prayer. Everyday life is a lengthy prayer. And so every now and then I would tell Sarah, I'm going to pray with St. Gregory. So I would go to my room and translate or work on some footnotes or complete my introduction or prepare an index and so forth. And so one cannot but live the very work you're doing. So for me, to work on the prayers of St. Gregory of Narek has been time of worship. And as a translator of ancient texts, I am very much at home with the classical language. You cannot translate an ancient author without having penetrated that author's thought patterns. So to translate the prayers of St. Gregory of Narek, apart from knowing the classical language, one has to read his prayers over and over and over again to the point of having such affinity with the author that you begin to think with him and you begin to figure out as to where he's going with it. And so I could tell you from the very outset of this book where the author is going with it from the very first prayer to the very last. And I see clear patterns. I see a trajectory. I can think with him. I understand him. All the more so being both a biblical scholar and a theologian and a medievalist. So it becomes natural, so to speak. It becomes part of you.
So you have been confessing something of the impact that this book of confession has had on you and has on many people. One of the next questions I think that many people would have in mind here is, so what sort of confession do we have in the book itself? Yes. Many people, of course, are familiar with the process of writing confessions. It's largely a sort of autobiography. You think first and foremost of the work of St. Augustine of Hippo, his confessions relating to his early life. So what sort of confession do we have in this book? And how far is this personal, individual in terms of the author? How far are these confessions that any reader could adopt, identify with, and appropriate themselves?
That's a very, very profound question, Peter. Just as you read in the introductory passage, that these prayers are for everyone under the sun. It's for all people. Now, are they personal confessions of sins committed by the author himself? I don't think so. To really answer this question, and more so for people who have read this book and they are kind of wondering how could this author be so inundated with so much sin, every conceivable sin imaginable is contemplated by him and confessed. And why would he do this? And I can give you at least a couple of good reasons why he would do this. For one thing, this is very important, and in a way, it's a key to understanding much of the rest of the book. A Christian is one who identifies with Christ. And this identity begins with baptism. St. Paul teaches in Romans chapter 6 what baptism signifies. Namely, when we are immersed in the water, it is like dying and being buried with Christ. That's why immersion is important in the Armenian baptismal service. It's death and burial. And when we're lifted out of the water, it is like being risen with Christ. This is what baptism signifies. And so baptism is initiation into discipleship. Discipleship defined as participation in the life of Christ, following Jesus in his footsteps, so much so that his experiences become the followers' experiences, and the Master, Jesus himself, identifies with his followers. Their experiences become his. That's why, let's say, when St. Paul was persecuting the nascent church, and Jesus appeared to St. Paul on the road to Damascus, and Jesus says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And Paul is astounded. He wasn't persecuting Christ, he was persecuting the followers of Christ. But you see how Christ identifies with his followers, and his followers identify with him. By its very definition, the word Christian means someone for whom Christ is the ultimate authority in matters of faith and life. And so, be it doctrine, be it persuasion, be it lifestyle, be it a prayer life, be it identity, being a Christian is identifying oneself with Christ. This oneness. Now, in the early church, there were only two sacraments. Baptism is the very first, and the second and only other sacrament was the Eucharist. And the Eucharist, the communion service, very much like baptism, signifies the same thing. When we partake of the body and blood of Christ, we take him in, he becomes one with us, and we become one with him. Very much as Jesus prayed in John chapter 17 to the Father, you in me, I in them, praying this prayer of unity. And I'll talk later on about that prayer. But this affinity with the Lord. So, if you are a Christian and you are a participant in the life of Christ, and Christ came to bear the sins of the world, well, once you identify with Christ, you may as well also identify or be a partaker, a participant in bearing the sins of the world with the Lord, to bear his cross, to bear one's own cross, to partake of another person's suffering and pain, which in very primitive thought was considered sort of a punishment for sin. And so you begin to see his ultimate affinity with Christ. And so these are not just his sins, but these are the sins of the world. These are everybody's sins. He feels with people. And this is what makes this prayer book great. You know, what makes us human is the fact that at the very bottom line of our existence, we have mutual feelings. And these mutual common feelings, we as a human family share in common. And for someone to penetrate that deep into human feelings and feel with the other and the rest of the world, to me, is overwhelming. And that's why you read of so many sins in this book. But yet they are composed in such a nice way that while you're lamenting, so to speak, or doing penance for these things, you are absorbed in them, and gives you a perspective into life that Jesus did not promise a rosy road to his followers. There is pain, there is suffering, very much like we read in the Gospel of John. If you take the Gospel of John and just went right through the middle of it, it's chapter 12. And in chapter 12, Jesus says, "Where I am, there shall my follower be." And you read these words in context. Jesus is talking about the cross, the way of the cross. So it's 2 chapters later in John 14 where Jesus says that where I am, there shall my servant be. Well, when you look at these words in the context of John 14, Jesus is talking about heavenly places. But let's remember that John 12 comes before John 14. Before thinking about being with Jesus in heavenly places, it is imperative that we be with him in down-to-earth places, to be with him at the foot of the cross, so to speak. And this is precisely the perspective our author has. He's going through the suffering of Christ as a participant in the life of Christ. You know, for us Armenians, when we go to church on Sunday and we partake of the Badarak, the Armenian word is haor to tune. Haor to tune literally is participation. Do we really know what we are participating in? We are participating in the life of Christ. And the significance of the Eucharist for St. Gregory of Narek could be a lecture in and of itself, but it is the key to really understanding the Book of Prayers.
Maybe this is a good point to read another section, which is from that particular prayer, number 53, right. Which I think gives a very clear sense then of this Eucharistic approach of St. Gregory in what again is another confession, very much like a pre-Eucharistic confession. I believe, Almighty, in your word, hence I confess. Hear the silence of my heart, Lord Jesus, which is the loud reverberation of my prolonged cry to you. You partnered with our body and image, and as high priest, the antitype who took away the yoke of the type. You offered your lauded body instead of animals slaughtered for sacrifice. You continue to be offered perpetually in an undying manner, and to grant undiminishing pardon, not only to those of few sins, but also to those for whom there seems to be no hope at the end of life. How could bodily members inclined toward sin foster life, even if they were to carry on for countless years? For this reason, you, God of all, who of your own free will took upon yourself to be the sacrifice, enduring death, are distributed for our atonement. Not that you, source of purity, have to die daily as a debtor to death. Rather, it was your will to be offered perpetually for our reconciliation, with the cooperation of your Spirit, and to please the Father. Since you, inscrutable God of all, took on my semblance for my sake and for my salvation, I too am united with you and participate in your very being through your all-embracing body. And you, benefactor for me and those like me, took my sins upon yourself, though you were sinless, accepted death that was the punishment meted out to me, and endured guilt in my name. As would be the case, I suffer willingly with you, who die often yet remain alive, who is offered through the divine mystery and is distributed in indivisible pieces, not by the hands of those who deny you, but by the faith of those who confess you. I think this very powerfully embodies exactly the approach that Dr. Terian was indicating.
May I add something to the context of this prayer?
Absolutely.
Within the book as a whole. You know, in ancient times, ancient authors figured a way to highlight what they want to highlight in their writing. And sometimes we have a technical word for it. We call it chiastic structure. Here is something to really ponder. If you take any manuscript of this prayer book, the oldest manuscript we have is from the year 1175, and it was the personal copy of a grandnephew of Saint Nersess Schnorhali, namely Saint Nersess of Lamphorn. It's a very beautiful manuscript in the Modena Taran,
Yes.
number 1568. Anyway, that's the oldest manuscript, but there are quite a few later manuscripts. You take any manuscript of this prayer book and go right into the very middle. In the very middle of the manuscript or the codex, you come to prayer 53. And what prayer 53 highlights is St. Gregory's response to Christ offering his body for our sins. That was prayer 53:3.
Yes.
In 53:2, St. Gregory has a very interesting things to say, and I would like to read it very, very briefly. I'll not read the whole section, but this is from prayer 53:2, just the prayer preceding what Professor Cowe read. When pondering with grateful praise the grace of this new salvation, I am dumbfounded by its infinite breadth, left speechless by it. Cogitating the endless favors from your light, from you to one entrenched in misery like me, I will implore you with your own prayer. I want to repeat this line. I will implore you with your own prayer, fitting it into the substance of my words, the very letters comprising this book of laments, which I shall fill with sorrows and sighs. I shall mix these with what you bestow with pleasure. And the prayer continues. I'm going to implore you with words of your own prayer, Lord. This is what he's saying. Now, quite a few interpreters of St. Gregory of Narek have been misled, thinking that the allusion here is to the Lord's Prayer, Our Father, but no. The Lord's Prayer is John 17. John 17 is Jesus' own Eucharistic prayer, where he pleads with the Father to watch over his followers, to keep them as one, as he, the Lord Jesus, is one with the Father. Speaking about union with God, the key passage in the Gospels is John 17, becoming one with God. Jesus imploring the Father for this unity to characterize his followers. And this is precisely a mystic's endeavor. That's the goal. That's the telos in mystic contemplation, where someone, a mystic like St. Gregory of Narek, and here I want to explain what we mean by the word mystic. A mystic is one who wants to connect with God. A mystic is one who wants to feel he has come as close as possible to God as one gets. Of course, we can never in this life and this earth attain that oneness with God, but no doubt that's our Christian endeavor. So a mystic will keep seeking that unity. And what is beautiful in the Eucharist is that it's a constant reminder. To go back to the passage we heard from Professor Cowe, you know, sometimes we Armenians or the Orthodox are misunderstood by our Protestant friends who kind of chastise us every time we do Badarak, as if we are crucifying Christ or sacrificing Christ over and over again, when in the epistle to the Hebrews, the apostle says, Christ was sacrificed once and for all for all. And why do you keep repeating this every Sunday? Well, in medieval times and in some places, they do it every day. Why do you keep doing this? It isn't that we're sacrificing Christ over and over again every day, every Sunday, every Saturday, whenever. It is we, believers, as participants in the life of Christ, bringing our participation into that one-time sacrifice which we commemorate over and over again, as Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. So this is a genuine Orthodox understanding of the Badarak. It is participation in the life of Christ. And this is what our author says. And in the paragraph I read, the prayer I read, the saint is giving us the key to understanding the book. He's saying to the Lord, I am going to pattern this whole book, my words, in accordance with your prayer. So, what is interesting is that the Badarak, the Eucharist, is not only in the middle of this book, it is anticipated ever since the beginning. And he runs with it to the very end when he ties it back with the other sacrament, namely baptism. And this comes up in a lengthy prayer, number 93, where he, like St. Paul, reminds us of the meaning of baptism as death, burial, and resurrection with Christ. Also another reason why St. Gregory is confessing all these sins. You know, the Apostle James admonishes believers to confess their sins in view of the last judgment. Well, St. Gregory of Narek, by his own admission, he also wanted to confess every conceivable sin so that on the judgment day there would be nothing to be held against him. He will have a free pass into the kingdom of God. And he was writing these prayers, let's remember, during the last 2 years of his earthly life, when apparently he was suffering in illness. And so, in view of that impending death, and what's next is the judgment. Another important thing we should remember is that St. Gregory of Narek thrived in the second half of the 10th century. And as we can think, by the end of the first millennium, there were all kinds of apocalyptic expectations regarding the end of time. And so people like him were indeed believing they were living in the last days. More so since the challenge of Islam was ever mounting. It was the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. They were threatening the Byzantine Empire. And then, of course, when the Byzantine Emperor, by the end of the 10th century, the Emperor Basil and his brother, expand the Byzantine Empire and one new conquest after another, St. Gregory of Narek writes a beautiful work called Panegyric on the Cross of Abarank, and he starts this panegyric with praise of the Byzantine Empire and the triumph of Christendom, not knowing that this very same Byzantine Emperor and his successors will dispossess the Armenian Bakradid kings of their possessions and the like, and that's how the Bakradid kingdom ended. But, you know...
I just wanted to add, and also, of course, the kingdom of Vaspuragan, where he was himself.
Exactly. So the end time was very much on the minds of these people. But I also want to give you another key to understanding this book, and this one comes early on. I will ask Professor Cowe to read it for us with his beautiful English, Scottish accent. I love it. So
Okay,
let's
which one is
hear
this?
Prayer 5, Section 2.
5-2.
You're right. And then I'll give you a little commentary on it, because these are not only translations, these are annotated translations. And the introduction is quite extensive. You can't just read this and try to understand it on your own, even when you read it in English. You need some help every now and then to see where the author is going with it.
Mm-hmm.
Please,
Okay.
Peter.
5-2. You created me in your glorious image, enabled a feeble one like me with your majestic likeness, adorned me with reason, burnished me with your breath, enriched me with thought, cultivated me with wisdom, buttressed me with intellect, set me apart from irrational creatures, instilled in me a rational spirit, enhanced me with a sovereign mind. You begot me as a father, suckled me as a wet nurse, cared for me as a guardian. You planted me, a wicked being, in your court, irrigated me with the water of life, cleansed me with the dew of the baptismal font, had me rooted by the stream of life, nourished me with heavenly bread, quenched my thirst with your divine blood, acquainted me with the incorporeal and unreachable existences, emboldened me to turn my earthly eyes to you, covered me with your glorious light, drew the clayish fingers of my unclean hands near to you, honored my abject mortal ashes as a ray of light, and out of love for mankind, you set your mighty, awesome, and blessed Father seal upon a wretch like me.
Thank you so much, Peter. For me, this is a key passage. And when I was early on in working my way through the prayer book, this passage really hit me in the face, so to speak. And here I'm going to share with you my understanding of this passage we just heard. Why St. Gregory of Narek would write something like this. He's telling us in what we just heard. You know, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it says, God created us humans in his image. So the early church fathers, or even earlier in Hellenistic Judaism, the Jewish intellectuals, before the time of Christ and in the time of Christ and since the time of Christ, they have this persisting question. Since we humans are created in the image of God, what in us is that image? And the standard answer, whether in Hellenistic Judaism, as in Philo of Alexandria, on whom I have 3 books, and my forthcoming book is a big one on the same author. Hellenistic Judaism is one of my specialties. The image of God was consistently interpreted as our intellect, our mind, our capacity to think. That's the image of God in us, our reasoning faculty. This is what makes us rational beings as compared to the irrational who were mentioned in the prayer. And so, if we were to think like St. Gregory of Narek thought, that our mind in us is the image of God, how do you reflect that image? It is the logos, is the rationality. It's what makes us articulate creatures who speak words, who write words, who express ourselves in creative ways just like the Creator. It is our mind. Now, let's jump to Genesis 2, verse 7. You know, God took earth from the earth, and then he breathed into that clay that he formed, and voila, behold, here are human beings. Male and female, God created them. The same question persisted. God breathed in us. What's the breath of God in us? The pneuma, to theu. They interpreted Genesis 2:7 exactly the same way they interpreted Genesis 1:27. The breath of God in us, the pneuma, the spirit, the breath, is our mind, our intellect, our rational faculty. So you have it both ways. The image of God and the breath of God in us is our capacity to think, to write, to be creative. Now, if you were a roommate of St. Gregory of Narek, and this is what you believed, and you want to be a writer, what would you do? This is what you believe. Since my mind, my intellect, is a reflection of the image of God in me, even though this image was marred, tarnished because of sin, this image is not, has not, never, ever been eradicated. The residue remains. What would you do? You will produce your very best to God. And so St. Gregory of Narek writes this book as a rational offering to God. Panavor badarak, a rational sacrifice. And what should believers bring to their God, to their Lord? Their very best. You don't bring something deformed or defective. So he is producing his very best to the best of his intellectual capacity. And what is so beautiful, in the oldest manuscript we have of this prayer book, there are 4 illuminations, 4 pictures. In the very first picture, he is praying. And the prayer is in the place where he's undertaking the writing of this book as a rational sacrifice. And guess what's the last picture, the 4th one? He's presenting this book to Christ. From thine own unto thee we offer. It's a rational sacrifice. It's another badarak. It's another participation in the life of Christ. And for a mystic like St. Gregory of Narek, this affinity we have with God, both being in the image of God and having the breath of God, we are kin to God. But guess what? This kinship, which meant so much to him and dominates much of his writing in this prayer book, this kinship with God, come to think of it, is compounded. It is compounded by the fact of the incarnation. Just as we were created in the image of God and have the breath of God in us, let's not forget that the Lord became human. He partook of our humanity, our very form. So this double kinship we have with God is something so overwhelming for him, to the point that what Jesus did, what Christ did by way of the incarnation and the sacrifice for which he came, namely his crucifixion to bring about our redemption, this is the ultimate expression of God's love. And therefore, no matter what attributes you give God, and believe it or not, St. Gregory of Narek has 99 of them in Prayer 3, which, by the way, I'll give you a little footnote on that, or else Professor Cowe could give, or Professor Koriwn could give. Why 99 attributes of God? God is beyond definition. Come to think of it, God has no name. God has no gender. We only think of God by virtue of his attributes. He is omniscient, he is the creator, he is merciful, he is compassionate, vormaz, martaser, parekut, ararich, you name it, you can go on and on, both defining God by his attributes rather than by his name, or sometimes defining God by what he is not. God is not avenging God. God is not angry. God is not punishing. God is, all the UN words you can give by way of adjectives to God. Now, here is the point. Of all the attributes of God, the one to be most distinguished, the one that deserves to be underlined 100 times, is martaser, lover of humankind. What God did through Christ by way of the incarnation and what Christ did on the cross tells you one thing about God, that God is a lover of humankind. If God would do this because of his love for humanity, what would you, as a follower of Christ, as a participant in the life of Christ, do for the love of humanity, for the love of one another, which is the prayer of John 17. I'm going to fashion my words in the very manner of your prayer. And so, when we go to church and we participate in the Badarak, as I said, it's all over the prayer book. A good chapter of it, the Badarak is preceded by special confessions. And he has them in chapter 34, prayer 34. In prayer 75, he has another further confession, and he connects it with his previous one when he is about to do Badarak. That's why prayers 33, 34 have become part of the Badarak in the Armenian church. When the curtain is closed, the officiating priest, the Badarakich, is going through the prayers of St. Gregory of Narek, prayer 33, 34. And what is so interesting in this book, like prayer 34, prayer 75, these are landmarks, equidistant landmarks from the beginning to the middle and from the middle to the end, lest we forget what this prayer book is all about. I read the prayer book of St. Gregory of Narek, and I see Badarak written all over it. And so, it is this particular thing that when we participate in the life of Christ, especially through the Eucharist, baptism is once in a lifetime. That's when we are initiated. That's why the Miron is so important when you read prayer 93. In fact, prayer 93, the Miron, is so important is because when this corruptible body is put in the grave and is corrupted, decayed, there is one thing that is not decayed, and that is the sign of the cross with which we are sealed at the time of our baptism with the Holy Miron. And that sign of the cross remains incorruptible, even though this body goes through corruption. And it is this mark of the cross which the angels recognize, and this leads the angels to resurrect the faithful who have this mark of Christ, who have received the mark of the cross at their baptism. And that's how the book ends. And before it ends like that, in prayer 92, the Gochnag, come to church. It's invitation. It's a call to church. Come, participate in the life of Christ. And so, for those who seek union with God, for St. Gregory of Narek, this union already exists. We're created in His image. As believers, we have His breath within us. As the objects of His love, He came to die for us. You know, this affinity with God already exists. And whatever union we seek with God is pinned to this initial kinship we have with God. And it is in this sense that St. Gregory of Narek is a mystic who has already discovered this union with God. It is not just through contemplation.
I think that building on one or two of your last points, we might develop another aspect of the work too, which is complementary to the liturgical. You mentioned the first manuscript that survives from 1173 that was the work, that was the possession of Nersess Lampronazi. One of the other four images there portrays the saint as a hysgor, as someone who was involved in vigil. And I think that this too is interesting, because fundamentally the ultimate hysgor, apart from God Himself, is of course the angels.
That's right.
And fundamentally here we see the development of the human being to ascend into these higher realms of existence, to become like the angel, in order then that, as St. Paul says, we should pray without ceasing. And therefore then, St. Gregory is the hysgor, this is the term he applies to himself in every prayer. And what I think is very significant here is, obviously, I remember very distinctly back in 1980, when I visited Armenia for the first time, I attended classes by the academician Vachin Albandian. And Vachin Albandian in the class said, so we only have, as Armenians, one great spiritual writer, and that is Gregory Narekatsi. We only have one. But what a fascinating, what a vast source of spirituality he is. And so we should be so delighted, so grateful that we have at least this one. So one of the things which I think is very important is that since 1980, we know, of course, a great deal more about the life, the background, the intellectual genealogy of this writer than was known then. And one of the things which I think is very significant is not only then do we see that this belongs to a tradition of spiritual writing in the Armenian Church before we get to the 10th century, but what is equally important is that this tradition of following the spiritual life and being guides in it and writing about it in more detail as time goes on, this also continued. So he was not this unicum. He was not this one spiritual flower after which we have the deluge. And there's actually an author that I've worked on from the 14th century, Mechitar Sasnetsi, who goes out of his way to use this term, hisgor, to apply to himself. Mm-hmm. And clearly it is because he sees himself as being very much in this prime tradition of Krikor Narekatsi as the exponent of the spiritual path for Armenians. So I think that's significant too. And then obviously, in addition to the directly sacramental, we also have this broader issue then of ghostly counsel. Clearly, so not only do we have Narek as being the confessor, but being the father confessor to all sorts of monks in the monastery, and being a model then for their own spiritual advance in terms then of leading this particular sort of path in the Christian life. And so I think that this is an important consideration too. We don't have, I think, too much time left. So I think that one of the points that I'd like to move on to, if I may, relates to the translation. Now, of course, you gave quite a lot of information about that earlier on, and so I think it makes sense to pass on to the readership. So you talked at some length about the situation of the writer. His human situation, his calling. We've mentioned something about the tradition out of which he emerges and which he renewed and which continued then after him. But one of the points that we have to admit, so on the one hand, this is a work which relates to everyone at all times. It embodies within itself this confession of every imaginable sin. It looks towards this salvation, forgiveness, new life that comes from that. But we have to admit that all of this is represented, is expressed very much in the medieval mindset, worldview and expression. So one of the later points that I think is important to raise is that, so for the people in this room and for people like us who are approaching this book very much in the 21st century, most of us not necessarily with much of the traditional elements that were the bread and butter, were the life and soul of the medieval monk that was Krikor Narekatsi. So what sort of guidance would you have in terms of, so you have lived your whole life with the Narek in your spiritual life. More recently, you've spent years working on this particular book and his other works. So what guidance would you have for contemporary readers like those here today on how to approach the text?
Thank you, Peter. I'm every now and then looking at Mrs. Gotchin to call the time, but we will go on till she signals us to quit. But here is what I would say in response to your question, Dr. Cowe. The liturgy of the Armenian Church has a pedagogical aspect to it. You know, it's too bad in the diaspora and so far removed from our medieval tradition, we don't sing all these charagans. We don't pray all these prayers. We select few things, and at best what we do is only tokenism. I must admit that the real thing is missing. So what we gather from the Sharagans, what we gather from these prayer books, foremost the prayer book of St. Gregory of Narek, there is teaching included in these prayers. For example, in prayer 34, he teaches what confession is. What is it about? When you approach Badarak, what is it all about? In prayer 75, he tells you what the meaning of the church is. And would to God every Armenian clergyman knows what the meaning of church is. You know, in other words, what we have is only tokenism of what was so genuine in medieval reality. In fact, at one time I challenged Armenian clergy by telling them, even Armenian hierarchs, that there was more creative worship in the medieval Armenian church than today, because today there is no room for creative worship in the Armenian church. We just go through the printed pages and we cut it short as much as we can. We skip grasping what it's all about. We have only uttered a few words here and there just by way of tokens. The real thing isn't there. And this is sad. But there is no reason for it to be like that. You know, let me give you one example, just one example, and let me conclude with something I began with. Namely, what our church did 100 years ago by canonizing the Armenian martyrs of the 1915 genocide. Are you ready for this? In the Armenian church, there is no special canon to canonize saints. It doesn't exist. Armenian-born saints, Hayadzin Surpere, Armenian-born saints commemorated in the Armenian church, they were known to be saints in their lifetime. And after their death, their distinction as saintly people continued, and so we refer to them as saints. Saint Gregory of Datev is not the last saint of the Armenian church. He was never canonized. His disciples, his contemporaries, the people who knew him immediately as a saint, continued to call him saint long after his death. And that's the tradition. You go to Jerusalem, we have two more Armenian saints. We seldom hear about them in the rest of the world. There is Surp Krikor Baronder, and there is Surp Krikor Shekhtayagir. These people were so saintly that in Jerusalem, to this day, they are referred to as Saint Gregory Baronder, a 17th century hierarch, patriarch of Jerusalem. Krikor Shekhtayagir, 18th century saint of the Jerusalem Patriarchate. To this day, he is a revered saint. In fact, they are commemorated, mentioned by name during Badarak, when we do the commemoration part, when we recall the saints. So, in order to have a liturgical event whereby our martyrs of 100 years ago were canonized as saints, believe it or not, the Armenian church invented the liturgy. That was creative worship. And thank God it was so beautiful and so meaningful. And it was rendered in such an impressive way, everybody whether people who lost relatives in the genocide or not, they were touched by the beauty of that liturgy. But that was creative worship. You know, would to God an Armenian derhire, an Armenian priest, an Armenian bishop, on months or even a year before a particular feast, would approach one of the parishioners, a talented person, a faithful churchgoer, and say, you know, on such and such a day we are going to celebrate the feast of St. Tripsime and St. Kayane. Would you please compose something for us to celebrate on the eve of this feast, just like they did in medieval times? All these sharagans we have, you know, it's not just the book of Sharagan. We have twice as many sharagans. We have the Kansarans and so forth. All this was the result of creative worship in the Armenian church in the medieval ages. Why can't have some of it today? Have something creative. Not necessarily during Badarak, but maybe before Badarak, after Badarak, the day before Badarak, the eve before a big feast. You know, such things are not alien to the Armenian tradition. These are at the very heart of our medieval tradition. Thank you. Go ahead. Well, I'm afraid our time is up.
Thank you so much. I mean, we can go out for hours and hours, both of Dr. Cowe and Dr. Terian. I've known Dr. Terian for many years. This is the fourth time he's lectured at the RFSC Museum. And I don't have any words to say. I'm just speechless. I wanted to mention that there was recently at UCLA the Nakash Ensemble that did a poetic musical program. And I think that there's a revival coming, what I'm noticing in Armenia now, of medieval poetry or poem by saints that are coming up now. So that was something that recently Dr. Cowe was also involved, I believe. Maybe he wants to mention something. So I'm very thankful to everyone that is here today and to support Dr. Abrahamian's work. And hopefully that we'll see him again and God give him good health so he can continue his mission. And anything else that anyone wanted to ask questions or anything, please feel free to do so.
Yes, we are willing to take questions. And if we can't answer, I'm sure Hagop could answer or Rupine could answer. This is your opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very, very wonderful presentation. It's hard to hear new and smart things being told about Narekatsi. So this was special. Anyone who has worked with Narekatsi knows that there are passages, there are lines, there are ideas or certain aspects in his text when you translate them that are stubborn and you have to struggle hours, sometimes weeks or months. I call them nightmares, wonderful nightmares. Which one was your wonderful nightmare?
Okay. Prayer 93, section 22. St. Gregory of Narek gets into what we call numerology or arithmology. That is to say, commenting on numbers, interpreting numbers. Some call it numerology. Now, this is the most difficult thing to interpret, even to figure out what the author is doing with these numbers. Now, as you know, in the Armenian alphabet, the alphabet carries numerical values. For example, IP is 1, To is 9, J is 10, Ini is 20, Lun is 30, He 40, Zagen. Okay. So in Armenian we have 36 letters. If you divide them into 4 columns of 9, okay, put the Armenian alphabet perpendicularly, vertically, from IP to To in the first column, then J to He, no, He is 40. Anyway, divide the alphabets into 4 columns of 9. Okay? So the first column would be the single numbers. The second column would be the two numbers, 3 numbers, 4 numbers. You know, the fourth column would be the thousands. Okay? Now, every time he calls a number, every time he calls a letter, the letter is the number. Go to that arusag, go to that table of the Armenian alphabets and color the number he calls. You know, it is almost like when you play a game, somebody calls a word or a number, you cover the number. What's bingo? Bingo, yeah, like bingo. Okay, you have a bingo chart, and St. Gregory of Narek is calling a number, and you go bingo, and you cover that number on this arusag of 4 columns of 9, 9, 9, 9 letters. Guess what you get? The cross. And nobody had figured it. In fact, most scholars are completely at a loss as to what to make of it. In fact, one distinguished scholar, in fact, the best known scholar on Narekatsi, has something very strange. He thinks these alphabetical numbers St. Gregory is calling are Attic Greek letters. You know, give me a break. How would he know Attic Greek? Attic Greek was a dead language in the time of St. Gregory of Narek. And so my point is that, of course, that was not my first exposure to numerology or arithmology. Philo of Alexandria does it a lot in his interpretation of the 6 days of creation and so forth. It is commonplace in Hellenistic Jewish thought. And once you know, quote, the game, you have it figured out. And so in my footnote, I have a diagram which interprets everything one reads in that prayer section. And you look, yes, that's the cross. He's calling the cross. And curiously enough, prayer 93, the cross is significant because chrismation is in the form of the cross. The cross is the focus of the chrismation. And it comes near the end of the prayer. It's interesting that he's giving you the key at the end rather than at the beginning. But once you think with him, you could pretty much figure where he's going with it. So to think with the author is imperative. And it dawns on you when you read him over and over and over again.
Hello, Dr. Terian. I want to ask you a quick personal question. You are a follower of Christ. You love Christ, you serve Christ, you believe in Him, and you obey Him, and you serve Him. Are you a saint? If yes, please say why. If no, please say why. Thank you.
You should ask that to my wife. Sometimes she has joked that it's not easy living with a saint. No, I'm not a saint. In fact, St. Gregory of Narek himself would have told people around, please don't call me saint. In fact, he does this. He does it. You know, sainthood is a virtue that is not acquired, it is bestowed. It is bestowed by grace, and it's grace working through others. So I do not claim to be a saint, far from that. In fact, I attended school with my classmate here, Sir Pots Tarkmanchats Varjaran, the School of Holy Translators. Not every graduate from that school, not even yours truly, is a holy translator. But yes, I'm a believer. I thank God for what Christ has done for me. And I would say, without Him, life would be meaningless. We would be no better than animals.
Okay, I think this concludes our event. Thank you very much. And Dr. Terian, Dr. Cowe, Vache, and Mangarian. And we do have a light reception downstairs. Everyone is welcome. Thank you.